22nd September 1943, Fjord, northern Norway. 0600 hours. Kapitän zur See Hans Meyer stands on the bridge of the Tirpitz, watching the morning mist lift off the dark water. The air is crisp, cold enough that his breath forms clouds. Behind him, the fjord stretches like a corridor of stone, steep cliffs rising on both sides. He can smell pine trees from the shore, mixed with diesel fuel and breakfast cooking below decks. Meyer is 51 years old, a career naval officer who commanded destroyers in the First World War. This morning, like every morning for the past 18 months, he surveys his defences with quiet satisfaction. 4 layers of anti-submarine nets stretch across the fjord entrance, each anchored to the rocky bottom and reaching to the surface. Steel cables woven into mesh that would snag any submarine trying to penetrate. Patrol boats circle the anchorage in shifts, their hydrophones listening constantly. On the surrounding hills, smokescreen generators stand ready to blanket the entire fjord in minutes if RAF reconnaissance aircraft appear. Meyer believes his ship is untouchable here. Not invulnerable, but protected by geography, by engineering, by the sheer impossibility of reaching a capital ship anchored 100 miles inside Norwegian waters. The British have tried twice with bombers. Both times the smokescreens worked, the narrow fjord made accurate bombing impossible, and Tirpitz emerged undamaged. Below him, 42,000 tons of steel and armour stretch forward and aft. 8 15-inch guns. 12 6-inch guns. Dozens of anti-aircraft weapons. Over 1,800 crew members, most confident that another quiet day stretches ahead. What Meyer doesn't see, what his hydrophones haven't detected, what his patrol boats haven't spotted, is the small shape moving along the fjord bottom 300 yards away, electric motors barely turning, hull scraping silently across rocks and silt. Inside X6, a steel tube 51 feet long and barely 6 feet in diameter, Lieutenant Basil Charles Godfrey Place is holding his breath. Not from fear, though fear is there, tight in his chest. He's holding his breath because the slightest sound might travel through the hull into the water, might reach German hydrophones, might bring depth charges raining down. Place is 22 years old, from Kent, Royal Naval College graduate. He volunteered for X-Craft service 9 months ago when recruiters told him survival odds were less than 1 in 10. The air inside X6 is thick, heavy with moisture and sweat despite the cold. Condensation drips from the curved steel overhead. His hands are cramped from gripping the periscope housing. The periscope flooded 2 hours ago, leaving them blind. He's navigating by dead reckoning now, by compass and depth gauge, and a chart memorized so thoroughly he can see it when he closes his eyes. Behind him, Sub-Lieutenant Robert Aitken monitors the electric motors. Engine room artificer William Whitley sits wedged beside the ballast controls. Diver Robert Whittam checks the breathing apparatus one more time, knowing the water outside is cold enough to kill them in minutes. Place knows the numbers. 6 X-craft departed Scotland 11 days ago. X9 was lost in a storm. X8 had to be scuttled. X10 never reached its target. That leaves 3 submarines attempting what the Admiralty considers operationally insane. Place's target is Tirpitz, but he doesn't know if X5 or X7 made it through, doesn't know if the 2 tons of Amatex explosive strapped to each side of his hull will be enough. What he does know is that in the next 30 minutes he'll either cripple the most feared battleship in the Kriegsmarine or die trying. But Place had something the Germans didn't expect, something that began 9 months earlier in a frozen hangar in Scotland, when a handful of volunteers looked at a steel tube and decided impossible odds were acceptable if the mission mattered enough. To understand how 4 men in a midget submarine ended up beneath Hitler's Pride, 300 yards from Kapitän Meyer's morning coffee, You need to go back to January 1943, HMS Varble, Scotland, January 1943. Place stood in the training hangar, breath fogging in the unheated air, staring at what the Royal Navy was calling a submarine, 51 feet long, 30 tons submerged, maximum speed 6 knots underwater, no torpedoes, no defensive weapons, just 4 men, a diesel engine for surface running, electric motors for submerged operations, and explosive charges carried externally on the hull. The briefing officer had been brutally direct. Tirpitz was strangling the Arctic convoys. Her mere existence forced the Royal Navy to deploy battleships, carriers, and dozens of escorts to guard every supply run to Russia. In July 1942, convoy PQ-17 had scattered when intelligence suggested Tirpitz might sortie. German U-boats and aircraft slaughtered the dispersed merchantmen. 24 ships sunk, 400 tanks lost. 3,000 vehicles, 99,000 tons of desperately needed supplies lost because one German battleship that never even left port created panic. The commander showed them photographs of Kofjord, the narrow entrance, the anti-submarine nets, the patrol boats, the cliffs that made bombing impossible. He showed them casualty figures from the convoys, British sailors burning in Arctic water, Russian soldiers starving because ammunition never arrived. Then he asked who was still volunteering. Every hand stayed up. Not because they were heroes, because someone had to go, and if they didn't, men would keep dying in those convoys. Place spent the next 6 months learning to operate X6 blind. They practiced cutting through nets underwater while maintaining neutral buoyancy manually. They practiced escaping from flooded compartments in water so cold the instructors kept medical teams standing by. They practiced navigation in total darkness. The training was designed to be harder than the mission. Some crews washed out. Place's crew gelled. Aitken could keep the motors running through anything. Whitley could calculate trim by the sound of water in the ballast tanks. Whittam could get out of a flooded compartment faster than anyone else in the program. But there was one problem no one had solved. The anti-submarine nets at Kofjord had no gates large enough for X-craft to slip through. Intelligence photos showed the nets stretched completely across the fjord entrance. The only opening was a boom gate that opened twice daily to let patrol boats through, but German lookouts watched that gate constantly. Place studied the problem differently. The boom gate opened at dawn and dusk. Dawn was when visibility was worst, when morning mist still clung to the water, when German lookouts were tired from night watch. If X6 surfaced just long enough to get a visual bearing, then submerged and followed a patrol boat through the gate in the boat's wake, they might slip through undetected. Might. By September, Place had run the approach sequence 47 times in training. He'd failed 22 times, but 25 times he'd made it through. The Admiralty decided those odds were good enough. On 11th of September 1943, 6 X-craft departed Scotland towed by parent submarines. On 20th of September, off the Norwegian coast, Place and his crew transferred to X6 in rolling seas. The passage crew looked exhausted. The X-craft's periscope had been leaking. The diesel engine was running rough. The trim was difficult. Place nodded, memorizing every detail, knowing that any of these problems could kill them. They cast off at 1800 hours. Ahead lay 100 miles of German-controlled waters. X6 ran on the surface that first night, diesel engine clattering, spray freezing on the casing. At 400 on 21st September, they dove to avoid German patrol aircraft. That afternoon, they encountered their first patrol boat. Place ordered crash dive. X6 dropped like a stone, bottoming out at 60 feet, hull scraping rocks. The propeller noise passed overhead, faded, disappeared. By evening they were approaching Kofjord. Seeing it through the periscope made Place's stomach tighten. Narrow, steep cliffs on both sides, and stretched across the entrance, the anti-submarine nets marked by floats. Place checked his watch. The boom gate would open at 04:30 the next morning. He had 10 hours to position X6 and accept that the next morning they'd likely be dead. Which brings us back to 600 hours on 22nd September. Place inches X6 forward at 2 knots. Every few minutes he checks the compass, calculates their position, adjusts course by degrees. His crew doesn't speak. They've trained for this silence. At 06:45, the periscope suddenly clears. Place raises it carefully. Through the eyepiece, he sees Tirpitz 200 yards ahead. Massive, dark grey paint. Guns trained skyward. He lowers the periscope before anyone spots it. Now he has a visual fix. Between X6 and Tirpitz, the final anti-submarine net encircles the battleship at 50 yards distance. This net has no gate. At 07:20, a German patrol boat approaches the net. Place watches as the boat signals shore, and a section of the net drops beneath the surface. The boat motors through. Place gives the order. X6 accelerates, following in the patrol boat's wake, passing over the submerged net section. Seconds before it rises again, they're inside the final perimeter, 100 yards from Tirpitz. But the periscope is flooding again. They're blind again. Place makes a decision. He'll surface just long enough to get one more bearing. At 07:30, Place orders emergency surface. X6 blows ballast and rises. The conning tower breaks the surface. Place throws open the hatch. For 5 seconds, he sees everything. Tirpitz directly ahead, position perfect. Then alarms begin wailing across the anchorage. A German lookout has spotted the submarine. Place drops back inside. Dive! Emergency dive! But it's too late. The Germans know they're there. Aboard Tirpitz, Captain Meyer hears the alarm and runs to the bridge. An officer reports a submarine sighted, positioned 200 yards off the starboard bow. Meyer's first thought is disbelief. How did a British submarine penetrate 4 nets? Sound general quarters, launch depth charges. If a submarine is inside the nets, it's here to attack. German sailors sprint to battle stations. Meyer grabs binoculars and scans the water. He sees nothing now, just ripples. Below the surface, X6 is dying. The emergency dive has damaged the trim system. Place fights the controls. Aitken works the pumps frantically, but the submarine scrapes the rocky bottom hard enough to throw everyone against the forward bulkhead. Place tastes blood from a split lip. But they're still beneath Tirpitz, and Place still has one chance. He gives the order. Release charges, both sides now. 4 tons of Amatex explosive detach from their brackets and sink to the fjord bottom. The charges settle into the silt directly beneath Tirpitz's keel. The fuses are set for 1 hour. At 08:30, they will detonate. It is now 07:32. Place has 58 minutes to escape. But X6 won't respond. The submarine wallows, porpoises, breaks the surface again uncontrollably. German machine gunners open fire. Bullets hammer the water around the conning tower. Whittam is hit by shrapnel through the open hatch. Blood sprays across the control compartment. The submarine's stern is on the surface now, propeller thrashing uselessly in the air. They're finished, and Place has 30 seconds to decide. He can scuttle X6 immediately. Surface with crew, surrender and live. The Germans will capture them and send divers to investigate. Those divers will find the charges, will defuse them. Tirpitz will survive. The mission will fail, or Place can keep trying, can stay in this sinking metal coffin and force the Germans to deal with the submarine itself, not what it dropped on the bottom, can buy time, even if it's only minutes, even if it means his crew will be prisoners when the charges detonate. Place looked at Aitken, bleeding from a head wound. At Whitley, hands blistered and torn. At Whittam, barely conscious from shrapnel. They'd followed him 1,000 miles. They'd trusted every decision. Place made the choice that would define everything. He ordered, full stop, open the main ballast, Let X6 surface completely. He climbed out of the conning tower, hands raised. "Cease fire!" he shouted in German. "We surrender!" The shooting stopped. German patrol boats closed in. Place stood on the casing, hands raised. Behind him, Aitken climbed out, then Whitley, then Whittam, needing help to move. 4 men, exhausted, bloodied, but alive. German sailors hauled them onto a patrol boat. An officer demanded identification. Place gave name, rank, serial number. The officer asked if there were explosives aboard. Place shook his head. Reconnaissance mission, equipment failure, no explosives. The German didn't believe him, but X6 was already sinking stern first, sliding under the surface. By 0740, the submarine had disappeared completely. The Germans assumed the threat was over. Meyer ordered the prisoners taken ashore. He ordered divers to search when the submarine settled, but he didn't consider it urgent. A failed reconnaissance attempt, no danger to Tirpitz. What Meyer didn't know was that at 0745 another submarine had just penetrated the inner net. X7, commanded by Lieutenant Godfrey, Henty-Creer, positioned itself beneath Tirpitz's bow. At 0750, Henty-Creer dropped his charges. 2 more tons of Amatex, now there were 4 tons under Tirpitz's stern, and 2 tons under the bow, 6 tons of high explosive, all fused to detonate at 8:30. Henty-Creer tried to escape, but the net cable snagged the propeller. The submarine jerked to a stop. At 8:20, 10 minutes before detonation, X7 was still trapped. Henty-Creer made the same choice Place had made. He surfaced, surrendered. German sailors pulled him and 2 of his crew from the submarine. The 4th man, Sub-Lieutenant Robert Lorimer, went down with X7 when it sank. The Germans now had 8 British prisoners and 2 captured submarines, and still didn't realize what was sitting on the fjord bottom beneath their most powerful warship. On shore, Place checked his watch. 0825, 5 minutes. Aitken sat beside him. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. At 0828, Meyer was in his cabin writing the incident report. 2 British submarines captured, obviously a reconnaissance mission. The defences had worked, no damage to the ship. He was still writing when the world exploded. At 8:30 hours, 6 tons of Amatex detonated beneath Tirpitz simultaneously. The explosion lifted 42,000 tons of battleship 3 feet out of the water. Every rivet vibrated, every weld flexed. The shock wave travelled through the steel like a hammer blow. In the engine room, a generator tore loose and crushed Oberbootsmann Smart Erich Müller instantly. 40 more were wounded, but the real damage was structural. The keel bent, not catastrophically, but enough. Enough to distort the hull shape by several inches, enough to misalign the 3 propeller shafts, enough to spring hull plates, opening seams that began flooding. Within 2 minutes, damage control teams were reporting flooding in multiple compartments. The port rudder was jammed. The center propeller shaft was bent beyond field repair. All 3 turbine engines had been knocked off their mountings. Tirpitz could not move under her own power, could not steer, could not fight as a fleet unit. Meyer stood on the bridge, ears ringing. Tirpitz was crippled, not sinking, but finished as an operational warship. On shore, Place heard the explosion, felt it through the ground. The German guards looked at the prisoners with new understanding. These were the men who'd just accomplished what RAF Bomber Command and the entire home fleet had failed to do for 2 years. 4 men in a steel tube had crippled the Tirpitz. Place didn't smile, didn't celebrate. He just closed his eyes for a moment, letting the shock roll through him. In that silence he thought of the men who had trained beside him, the sailors who froze in Arctic waters, the Russian soldiers who waited for ships that never arrived. Today, at last, the shadow over the North Atlantic had been broken. If you believe the courage of men like this should never fade into silence, subscribe. Your subscription helps keep their stories alive for the next generation. The German reaction was immediate. Meyer ordered maximum security. Gestapo arrived within hours. Place and his crew gave name, rank, serial number. Nothing else. German engineers swarmed over Tirpitz. The keel was distorted over 60 feet. Hull plates were sprung. All 3 propeller shafts were damaged. The main turbines were displaced. 6 compartments were flooded. German Naval Command chose Norwegian repairs, but those repairs would take 6 months. 6 months during which Tirpitz posed zero threat. The strategic impact rippled outward immediately. Within a week, the Admiralty reduced Arctic convoy escorts by 30%. Battleships were reassigned to Pacific operations. Cruisers went to the Mediterranean. The convoys kept sailing. In late December, British forces sank Scharnhorst, which had sortied without Tirpitz support. The sinking of Scharnhorst was only possible because British forces could concentrate without worrying about Tirpitz. One crippled battleship changed the naval balance in the Arctic, but there was cost. Of 6 X-craft that departed Scotland, only 2 reached the target. X5 was lost with all hands, probably depth-charged. X8 was scuttled before reaching Norway. X9 was lost in a storm. Of 12 operational crew members who entered Fjord, 6 survived as prisoners. 6 died. Lorimer drowned when X7 sank. The crew of X5 was never recovered. Their submarine was found on the fjord bottom in 2003, intact, with all crew still aboard. The Germans had depth-charged it repeatedly. The submarine had imploded. For the survivors, the war wasn't over. Place, Aitken, Whitley, and Whittam spent the rest of the war in German POW camps, and they were interrogated repeatedly, offered better treatment for intelligence. They refused. They endured solitary confinement, reduced rations, psychological pressure. They gave nothing beyond name, rank, and serial number. In December 1943, a German officer approached Place with a newspaper. The headline announced Lieutenant Basil Charles Godfrey Place had been awarded the Victoria Cross. Place's response was characteristically understated. Pity they couldn't have sent a food parcel instead. Lieutenant Godfrey Henty-Creer was also awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously. The German perspective revealed a fundamental doctrinal failure. Publicly, Nazi propaganda downplayed the damage. Radio broadcasts claimed Tirpitz had been lightly damaged. But privately, Admiral Karl Dönitz wrote in his diary that Operation Source was a feat of great daring and lamented that German forces had failed to prevent it. Meyer remained in command during repairs but never took the ship to sea again. His career effectively ended that morning. German doctrine had failed to anticipate the British approach. They'd assumed attacks would come from conventional submarines or aircraft. They hadn't considered that the British would develop submarines small enough to penetrate nets physically and carrying enough explosive to cripple a capital ship. It was a failure of imagination. The contrast in doctrine was stark. German forces operated within rigid command structures. When lookouts spotted X6, they followed procedures, sounded alarms, waited for orders. By the time those orders reached gun crews, X6 had already dropped its charges. British doctrine emphasized decentralized decision-making. Place didn't radio for permission when his periscope flooded. He assessed the situation and made the decision that gave the mission the highest probability of success. That flexibility was precisely why 6 midget submarines succeeded where conventional forces failed. Tirpitz never fully recovered. Repairs continued until March 1944, but the battleship's capabilities were permanently compromised. Maximum speed dropped from 31 knots to 27. Crew morale never recovered. They knew they were serving on a crippled target. Fleet Air Arm attacked in April 1944, then again in August, then September. Each attack inflicted more damage. Finally, on 12th November 1944, RAF Lancasters carrying tallboy bombs attacked Tirpitz. 3 scored direct hits. The battleship capsized and sank with over 1,000 crew lost, but the ship that sank in November 1944 had been effectively dead since September 1943, when 6 tons of Amatex detonated beneath her keel. After the war, Place returned to Britain and remained in the Royal Navy, eventually reaching Rear Admiral. He never spoke publicly about Operation Source in detail, insisting he had simply done his duty. The choice Place made at 07:32 hours on 22 September 1943 reflected a fundamental principle of British naval warfare. When tactical situations demanded immediate action, junior officers were expected to assess, decide, and act on their own authority. That capacity for rapid, independent decision-making under extreme pressure was precisely why Operation Source succeeded where conventional operations failed. The Germans aboard Tirpitz that September morning believed their defenses made them untouchable. 4 layers of anti-submarine nets, constant patrol boat coverage, hydrophones monitoring every sound. They believed these measures created an impenetrable barrier. They were wrong. They couldn't imagine an enemy willing to send men in steel tubes 50 feet long across 1,000 miles of hostile ocean to place explosive charges by hand against a battleship's hull. That failure of imagination cost them their most powerful naval asset and the strategic initiative in the Arctic for the remainder of the war. This is Britain in battle. These stories are disappearing. The last veterans who knew men like Place and Henty Creer are in their 90s now. Soon, no one will be left who remembers what it meant to climb into a midget submarine, knowing the odds of coming back were 1 in 10. If you believe these men deserve better than footnotes in history textbooks, subscribe. Help us preserve their stories with the detail and respect they earned before time runs out. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions directly support Britain in battle and help us bring you more untold stories.